I was having a real dilemma. I was starting to educate myself about history, and what I realized was that throughout history, there's always been a group of people who want to control another group of people. And that may not be a problem in and of itself, but one of the biggest challenges is that very often the controlled haven't agreed to be controlled. And I found that with my research, there were people who worked very hard to try to prevent this. They had written down fundamental freedoms, you might call them, that human beings expect to have. And one of these documents I found, which might relate to the self-interest of all of us here, is a document called the Canadian Bill of Rights. And this was written in 1960, and it was called a quasi-constitution, which means that it can't be abridged by other rules that come since, other laws that come since. And in the preamble of that document, though it is a little bit dated, is very interesting because it says something to the effect, and I'll paraphrase here, that the Parliament of Canada sees the nation of Canada as being founded within a society of free men. Now, before we get too worried about the sexism there, we got to realize this was written about 60 years ago when they usually said men, which meant humanity, mankind, and so on. But I think it's instrumental to see that they said it was founded, which means it's foundational, and that Canada is within the society of free men. So in other words, what they're saying is that we're not really in Canada. Canada is within our society. So we see that they acknowledge that we are above, because we create all of that. So we are really sovereign. They're recognizing that we are sovereign above all of that. But why was I concerned, you might ask? Well, what I realized in history is that in spite of all the great writings that people do, there always tends to be control freaks that come in and try to abridge this sort of thing. And what I realize is that even here in what we call Canada, there are many people who are in jail for not having harmed anybody. This became very close to me because I knew of somebody where this happened. And what I found out from a lawyer friend of mine is that the foundation of law or a legal system is an injured party. There must be an injured party. There must be somebody been injured before dire punishments like that are given out. But it happens anyways. So it seems like there's, in spite of the great document, it's being abridged. Now, I tried in my efforts to use reason to help people to understand the importance and the seriousness of this, but I find that people get stuck in their ways and I wasn't getting through. So I decided to do something epic. I decided to share my own freedom through doing something a little bit drastic of walking 8,000 kilometers with my freedom flag on the back as a conversation piece as I went along, and I spoke at different areas. So this began the 5th of March, 2016, at the beach in Victoria where I dipped some Pacific water, and it ended on the 13th of September in Cape Spear, Newfoundland, where I committed a little bit of Pacific water and got a little bit of Atlantic water as a memento for that. Now you might ask, what did I really experience throughout that whole thing? Well, what I did is I experienced my own example of freedom, and I shared that through my blog on Facebook. A couple of key points that I learned, 3 in particular that I experienced, was fundamentally first, what was freedom to me? And freedom to me was the action. If I strip everything else away, my actions. It had nothing to do so much with what the clouds were doing, what other people were doing, but how I could affect my freedom was through my action. Because walking through the wilderness day after day, everything else is stripped away, and I realized how important what I was doing towards my action. That was the first point. The second point I learned in my experience was how I was bound up with many fears and inhibitions in my life. And they would hold me back from things. For example, in Newfoundland there were a lot of bears. But yet I found out the fact that never has there been in history an attack of a bear on a human being. So I realized this is not necessary. I can camp with the bears and make my peace with them. There were other examples, but it taught me that fears can be separated as legitimate and not legitimate, and therefore freedom can be increased. The final thing I learned, this may sound rather strange, but I got a very good sense of what I was, the I within me. That may sound strange, but what I realized is that for me, the I within is the free will agent of action within me. Lots of things were going on, lots of activities. The wind was blowing, the rain was falling, the deer were running. My cells, my blood and so on was running, but I didn't have sovereignty over that. The only thing I had sovereignty over was my actions to make a decision to get up and walk or not. That's where I learned about the I. Now, I hope this makes sense. And I hope that my experience of freedom over 8,000 kilometers makes sense in terms of those 3 points. Of the boiling it down to what it actually is, defining freedom. Of the recognition that we all probably have fears and inhibitions that we can get beyond. And of discovering a little bit more about ourselves in terms of what we are in reference to freedom. I hope this is persuasive to see that freedom is important and how we relate to it is important. Madam Toastmaster.
Well done.
Thanks, Bill.
You're still recording, but you can't shut it off.
Yeah.